If you enjoy this program, come on over and join us at the World of Warbirds Patreon. There's plenty of free stuff there, including all the images to accompany the episodes, so you can see what I'm talking about. If you want to commit to the relationship, there are advantages to being a patron of the podcast, such as getting this episode a week earlier, and getting bonus episodes, and you'll have the satisfaction of helping contribute to the podcast. If you are presently listening to this through Patreon, thank you for your support. Now, on to today's show. Hello, and welcome to World of Warbirds. I'm Brian Pierce. I started off this podcast with the idea that even though I'm Canadian and had relatives who fought in World War II, that this show would be neutral. There would be no bad guy or good guy airplanes. So with that policy, even though I'm a guy from the Commonwealth, I'm able to say that the story of the HE-177 is a sad one. It begins with revolutionary ideas and hope and promise for an airplane with such great performance that the end results are just so disappointing. Let's take a close look at the birth, the sad life, and the tragic end of the HE-177 Greif. Nazi Germany never had a firm strategic bombing policy. Plus, the concept of blitzkrieg, with which they started the war, actually ran counter to the idea of industrial bombing. If you could knock out your enemies in a series of lightning-quick campaigns, then there was no need for a long-term program to degrade and destroy the enemy's industry. You didn't need heavy bombers for such a conflict. What you needed was a large number of flying artillery-type aircraft, like Stukas. Unlike the Allies, Germany had no bomber mafia or bomber command to advocate for heavy bombers. The only real bomber advocate that they had was General Walter Wever, who was a World War I veteran and a hearty supporter of the strategic bomber, and was pushing for them as early as 1934. Initially, it was for the Ural bomber that he was seeking, figuring, correctly as it turns out, that in any war against Russia, the Soviets would pull their industry back, and that the Luftwaffe should have a way to hit it. Prototypes of the Ural bomber were ordered, such as the Dornier Do-19 and the Junkers Ju-89. These were not particularly successful. But Wever continued pushing for new designs for this role, and in this light, the 3rd of June 1936 was a good news, bad news kind of day for him. The good news was the Reichsluftfahrtministerium, or RLM, the German Aviation Ministry, published a specification for exactly what he was looking for. It was seeking an aircraft to carry at least 2,200 pounds of bombs with a range of 3,100 miles and a maximum speed of not less than 311 miles per hour at altitude. This was known as the Bomber A project. The bad news for Wever was that he was killed in an air crash on that very same day. The Bomber A project would have to continue without his pressure and guidance. Heinkel Flugzeugwerke picked up the project and began work. Ernst Haeckel's chief designer, Siegfried Gunther, was assigned to the job. The design began with engines. Now, if we think of engine configurations for large aircraft from the time, you probably think 4 engines. But in the late 1930s, there was a debate about this. Was it better to have a large aircraft powered by 2 high-powered engines and 2 props? Or 4 lesser-powered engines and 4 props? There were disadvantages and advantages to both. Let's look at the 2 super-engine design. The main advantage to this is that there would be less drag with the 2-engine design. There would be 2 less nacelles and less propeller drag. Plus, by counter-rotating the propellers, there should be improvements in stability and an improvement in maneuverability. In fact, knowing all that, it seems strange that more manufacturers didn't go for the twin super engine design. Two that did were Avro with its Manchester and Heinkel with its Bomber A proposal that they were now calling Project 1041. One obvious problem was the need for the super engine that would be producing at least 2,000 horsepower. For the Manchester, Avro was working with the Rolls-Royce Vulture engine. It was an X24 configuration, which basically took two Rolls-Royce Peregrine-derived V12 blocks and arranged them in an X shape and turned a common shaft. But it was still one engine. Why do I say that? Just stick with me here. Over in Germany, they went a slightly different route. And I'm going to go into some detail here because the engine will be integral to our story. In order to get a 2,000 horsepower super engine in production, Daimler-Benz decided to take what seemed at the time like a logical shortcut. Why not just take two successful, lower-powered engines and join them together? In a compact package, the engine would produce double the power with hardly an increase in drag. The successful engine that they chose was their very reliable DB601. It was used to power such aircraft as the Messerschmitt Bf109 and Bf110. Over in Italy, Alfa Romeo would even buy a license to produce the DB601 as the Alfa Romeo RA1000 Monsone, which would be used to power their C202 Folgore. I'll just stop for a very quick aside right now. As time goes on and my back catalog expands, there are more and more existing episodes on the subjects I cover. For example, to expand on what you're hearing today, you could listen to my Cylinders: The Quest for Power episode. There are also existing episodes on the Bf109, Bf110, and the Folgore, as well as the story of the Manchester, which is told in the Lancaster episode. Okay, enough self-promoting and back to our main story. As I said previously, the DB601 was a very reliable, supercharged, liquid-cooled, inverted V12 engine rated at about 1,200 horsepower. The DB601's propeller shaft was driven clockwise via a gear reduction housing mounted to the front of the engine. One really interesting feature was that the gear reduction was made so that a gun or cannon could be mounted behind the engine and would fire right through the V between the cylinder banks and out the propeller's hub. Mounted to the rear of the engine was an accessory section that provided the drives for magnetos, generator, starter, the fuel and oil pumps, and the supercharger. In order to double the power, two DB601 engines were mounted side by side at an angle of 44 degrees and joined by a common propeller gear reduction box. Placing these two inverted V engines together basically created an inverted W engine. The right and left sections were referred to as the W motor and the X motor. The exhaust ports for both inner cylinder banks were positioned in the very narrow space between the two engine sections. At the front, the two engines drove a new propeller gear reduction drive. The two engine sections turned a single propeller, but no gun or cannon could be fitted to fire through the propeller hub this time. Although joined together, the left and the right engine sections remained separate, with the exception of the gear reduction and the rear mount. The coupling gear section, which joined the engines, was pretty remarkable. Firstly, it allowed for the manual decoupling and recoupling of the engine sections. However, recoupling could only be accomplished when the engine sections were operating at the same RPM. There was also a feature whereby an engine section would automatically decouple if its speed dropped suddenly compared to the other engine section. So if one of the 601 engines died, it would be automatically isolated and the other side would continue to turn the prop. Coupling and decoupling could also be done manually from controls in the cockpit. To disengage an engine section, a lever for that engine on the gear reduction housing had to be pulled forward. This would pull the coupler towards the propeller and disengage it from the crankshaft. The coupler would still be connected to the gears in the reduction housing. The levers on the engine were linked to levers in the cockpit, and the individual engine sections were even started one at a time and then coupled together when they were going nicely. The coupling section really seems almost magical. By using a combination of gears that I cannot really explain or even visualize, the propeller of the DB606 could be chosen to turn either clockwise or counterclockwise without changing the actual counterclockwise rotation of the engine's crankshafts. This allowed for an easy counter-rotating of the propellers. This engine system had worked really well for Heinkel's own HE-119 high-speed reconnaissance aircraft prototype, and in Messerschmitt's ME-216 Adolphin, and so why wouldn't it work well here? So, a year after beginning work, on the 2nd of June 1937, Heinkel Flugzeugwerke got the go-ahead to construct a full-scale mock-up of its Project 1041 Bomber A. Things look great. Heinkel's team estimated that the new bomber would have a top speed of 342 miles per hour, which was even faster than the published requirement. In order to hopefully achieve this impressive speed, Siegfried Gunther had selected multiple features to cut down on drag. The first were the 2, or 4, depending on how you looked at it, super engines in 2 nacelles. The second was using a very fancy engine cooling system that had heretofore been only used on racing aircraft. The usual method for dumping heat in a liquid-cooled engine was to hang a radiator somewhere so that the passing air could pass through it, pick up the heat, and take it away. Hanging this thing out there inevitably causes drag. The newfangled fancy setup was known as a surface evaporative cooling system. Instead of just running the liquid through the engines, the coolant is pressurized, as in a pressure cooker or instant pot, which raises its boiling point to about 110 Celsius or 230 Fahrenheit, meaning that it can actually pick up more heat. As the superheated water leaves the engine, it is allowed to expand to and flash to steam, which is then routed along a network of pipes along the surface skin of the fuselage and wings, where it is cooled and then returned back to the hot engine. Notice that in this system there's no fat radiator sitting in the airstream causing drag, so the fancy system is very efficient and clean. It had worked on the previously mentioned Heinkel HE-119 high-speed reconnaissance aircraft, so why wouldn't it work well here? Another place where weight and drag would be saved would be in defensive armament. The new bomber would feature 3 remote-controlled gun turrets. Rather than having a big hole in the fuselage where a gunner would swing guns around manually and causing a lot of drag, the gun and control positions would all be nicely glazed over and clean. Also, there was a bonus that the gunners would be sitting in safer and more comfortable locations. Everything was looking great for the new bomber, which was to be known as the HE-177 Greif, which means griffin and not grief. There was no reason to believe at all that there would be any grief, right? In November 1937, the mock-up version of the aircraft was completed. About that time, data was flowing in from Luftwaffe units operating in the Condor Legion in the Spanish Civil War. One of the discoveries being learned in the conflict was that level bombing wasn't very accurate. The Luftwaffe was getting much more accuracy with its dive bombing aircraft, such as their famous Stuka. Now, when it comes to the level bombing program, one can come to many conclusions with this information. You could decide that your bomb site needs to be better, or that perhaps larger formations of bombers would be needed to cover the target area, or you could decide that your level bombers should also have dive bombing capability. And although the Luftwaffe did incorporate the first 2 suggestions into their plans, they also included the third. The Greif was going to have to be able to do something that it had never been conceived to do. Dive bombing. Actually, that's a bit of an exaggeration. It was going to be asked to do glide bombing, which is a much shallower diving version of dive bombing, but still not something in the original plan for the Greif. On the very day that Ernst Heinkel was showing off the mock-up aircraft to the Luftwaffe, he was told that, now it also has to be able to do 60-degree diving attacks. He must have wanted to say, "Are you freaking crazy?" But instead just said that the aircraft was not capable of it. But, nonetheless, the designers started to try and make it capable. Perhaps because of trying to make the impossible possible, there are a dizzying number of variants for this aircraft. And so we don't choke on the glut of letters, numbers, and hyphens, I'm going to simplify these down so that we can just appreciate the essential story of the Greif. In order to allow the bomber to do 60-degree diving attacks, a whole lot of airframe strengthening was going to have to happen. This was also already happening in the wing area. It seems like the wing people and the flap people hadn't been talking properly in the early stages. The Greif was to have Fowler flaps that extended along the whole trailing edge of the wing, including where the ailerons were. These flaps would slide out and down from under the wing, and the ailerons would still have to function for control during flap use. The flaps were putting undue stresses on the wings, which were judged to be about 30% below strength, even before the whole glide bombing capability thing was added, which also added dive brakes under the wings. Early prototypes showed damage on the outer panels of the wings, and eventually the whole wing structure had to be redesigned and strengthened. The same process was going on with the rest of the airframe, which ended up causing a bad feedback loop. Due to the strengthening, the airframe got heavier and heavier, which meant that it was much more easy to overstress due to the increased weight. Increased weight was also causing problems with the landing gear. Not only did the gear need to be beefed up to handle the aircraft that was packing on the pounds, the legs needed to be longer than usual to provide ground clearance for the longer than usual 4-bladed propeller, which was almost 15 feet in diameter. There just wasn't enough room in the one nacelle for the more conventional setup, so a novel one was arranged. 2 legs attached to 2 wheels would extend down from the main spar at each nacelle. During retraction, the outboard leg would retract upward and outward into its shallow wing well. The inboard leg would swing the opposite way, upward and inward into a well in the wing root. Although it solved the problem, it was a complex system, and supposedly it took 2 hours just to change a main gear tire, and this required a specially designed gear jack to do it. On the 9th of November 1939, the first prototype took to the air briefly. The test pilot landed after only 12 minutes due to overheating engines. Also, even during such a short flight, the test pilot noted vibration in the propeller shafts, insufficient travel of the tail surface, and flutter in the elevators. Prototype number 2 experienced the same tail flutter problems when first asked to perform a diving attack, and it got so bad that the tail broke up and the aircraft was lost. Following prototypes had their tail surfaces increased by 20% in size and strengthened. Another element that needed much testing was the coupling gear section and propeller control mechanisms. One of these failed during another testing flight, and prototype number 4 crashed too. There were disappointments in other areas also. The planned, advanced, remote-controlled turrets were just not working out. And so Heinkel reverted to more conventional guns positions, which meant more weight and drag. Interestingly enough, the first tailgun designs required the tail gunner to lie prone for the entire mission, which restricted his movements and was not very comfortable. Later versions had a tailgun position where he could sit. All this extra weight and drag meant more demands being placed on the engine systems for more power, which meant that they were being pushed harder and harder, and producing more and more heat, and they were running hot. The advanced cooling system just wasn't keeping up and had to be replaced by conventional annular radiators, which were fitted directly behind the propellers. These added, well, you know now, more weight and drag, which again would further tax the engines. Oh, the engines. We haven't even gotten to the problems with the engines. When we go through the litany of issues, it almost seems as though they were designed by saboteurs to try to ruin the whole program, destroy the aircraft, and kill the air crews. The DB606 engine proved to be very troublesome. Some of its least bad problems was excessive vibration and trouble with the coupling mechanism. Also, the oil tended to foam at altitude, which meant that some parts weren't getting lubrication and would fail, with parts such as connecting rods shooting through the crankcase. But these were not even the worst problems. Unlike its earlier installation on the HE-119 and the ME-261, these engines were cowled very tightly, and it was difficult for maintenance crews to keep the engine compartments clean, especially between the two engines of the engine systems. This cleaning became more and more important as the engine fittings and seals were more and more prone to leak and weep, partly caused by material shortages and substitutions during the war. Oil and hydraulic fluids would pool in the engine compartments between the two engine sections. This area was extremely hot, as even the annular radiators were unable to keep up with this engine cooling. The pooled, flammable liquids would eventually be ignited by the hot exhaust's radiant heat. There was also no firewall, and so fires in the engine nacelle would quickly spread to the main gear and ignite any leaking hydraulic fluid found there. As the engines were well behind the pilots, fires would often not be noticed until it was too late, and the wing spar would be burned through, causing wing failure. Later on, there was an improved engine system called the DB610, and a firewall was added. And although better, the same problems were still present. Many airplanes get nicknames by their crews. Luftwaffe Feuerzeug, or Air Force Lighter, is not one of endearment. So, dear listeners, many of you may be wondering, why didn't they just scrap the power system thing and switch to 4 engines? The Avro Manchester had also experienced many engine problems before switching to 4 engines. Why hadn't Heinkel switched too? It had been considered early on, but at that time the dive bombing requirement had precluded it. Finally, in 1942, plans for the 177B were started when the dive bombing requirement was dropped, and several 4-engine prototypes were built. When they first flew in 1943, the test pilots stated that they could not believe a 4-engine heavy bomber could possess such excellent handling qualities. It really makes one wonder if the decision had been made much earlier. As such, by the time the possible winning formula for the 177 had been found, it was too late, and the emergency fighter program in early 1944 meant the end for the entire 177B development program. From all that I have described so far, I guess you can guess that the 177's operational history was troubled. In April 1944, units reported that the Greif had good flying characteristics, but had unacceptable engine troubles and problems with its airframe strength. In the emergency that was the Battle of Stalingrad, it was tried as a transport or air evacuation aircraft, but was found unsuitable for both. It reverted to bombing and flak suppression missions near Stalingrad, but only 13 missions were flown with a loss of 7 machines due to self-inflicted engine fires, not caused by enemy action. The Greifs did have some limited successes in 1943 during Operation Steinbock, which was known by the Brits as the Baby Blitz. To survive, they would climb up to 23,000 feet, while still over friendly territory, then approach the target in a shallow dive with engines throttled back, crossing the bomb release point at about 15,000 feet. After bombs away, the pilots would reopen the throttles, turn, and continue descending at 700 feet per minute in order to keep the speed up to re-enter friendly airspace at about 2,500 feet. Even so, many of the 177s involved would be lost or have to turn back due to overheating or burning engines. And that's if they weren't picked off by British Beaufighter or Mosquito night fighters. The greatest success of the HE-177 was probably the large raid of about 90 aircraft against railway targets 280 miles west of Moscow on the 19th of July 1944. 3 large attack wedges of about 30 aircraft, each loaded with 4 551-pound or 2 1,102-pound bombs, hit the target during the day at an altitude of about 20,000 feet. Losses were relatively light, as the Soviet Air Force was not equipped to deal with high-flying bombers. Again, it makes one wonder what would have happened if the Greif had been allowed to mature in the same way as the Lancaster. As I said before, there were some attempts to reform the 177. In September 1942, the dive bombing requirement was dropped and work began on making a true 4-engine version of the Greif known as the 177B. It was powered with 4 individual Daimler-Benz DB603 engines. These were liquid-cooled, 12-cylinder inverted Vs that were used to power such successful machines as Heinkel's own HE-219 Uhu night fighter, the ME-410, and the ultimate FW-190s, which were actually known as TA-152s. These engines were on new, longer span wings, fitted with annular radiators right behind the propellers, so engine cooling was no longer to be a problem. The 177Bs also had twin tail fins in order to improve the in-flight handling characteristics of the 177. Around the same time, Heinkel was also working on the 277, which was the version of the Greif intended to bomb America. It's rather difficult to know where the 177B project ends and the 277 begins. And there have even been some comments that the 177B was just a cover for the 277. Who knows? Neither came to much. There were just 3 prototypes of the 177B, and their production was cancelled in the drive to produce more fighters for the emergency fighter program in early July 1944. Due to the chaos at the end of the Third Reich, there are few photos and little knowledge of their final locations. The story of the 277 and the other America bombers will be covered by another episode which is in the works. There were little to no operations of the HE-177s after the summer of 1944. The previously mentioned emergency fighter program took priority, and there just wasn't enough fuel for offensive bombing operations. In late 1944, Captain Eric Brown, who seemed to fly everything in his career except Snoopy's doghouse, also flew the HE-177. After testing it, he wrote that the handling characteristics were, opening quotes, positive about all axes. But the controls were all remarkably light for such a large aircraft. Indeed, I had the feeling that the elevator was dangerously light, and I was all too aware of the intelligence reports of HE-177s breaking up in the air. So I decided to treat this control very gently. The aircraft had an automatic pull-out device and an acceleration warning apparatus fitted, but it really was nail-biting to have to treat a giant like this immense Heinkel bomber as if it were made of glass. As for the stalling characteristics, with flaps and undercarriage lowered, the aircraft buffeted violently at 87 miles per hour before the nose dropped at 84 miles per hour. The buffet experience was so violent that I had some concerns over structural damage. Somehow the HE-177 always conveyed an impression of fragility despite its size. It was one of the very few German aircraft of the period that I tested that I did not enjoy flying." Close quotes. All HE-177s that survived the war were scrapped, and not one of the almost 1,200 examples built survive. I don't often get to the end of an episode feeling down, but I do with this one. The HE-177 started off with such promise and such hope. With all its revolutionary features, and due to stupid decisions, poor leadership, bad planning, lack of foresight, and delay, ended up just collapsing under its own flaws. It stands in such stark opposition to the many, many examples of Luftwaffe aircraft that ended up having long histories, doing many tasks for which they were not intended. It's enough to make one say, "Good grief." Alright, sorry about that. I've been trying to work that phrase in there somewhere. Thanks to all who support the podcast through Patreon or PayPal. I appreciate it more than you know. You can check out photos of what we've been talking about on the Patreon page. These are free and available to all. Until next time.